Hi, it is Erev Yom Kippur 2020, 5781. This is the talk that I hope to give tomorrow, just for Yizkor on Yom Kippur. It's not necessarily for children, 10 and up maybe. And this past spring, time had a quality that I haven't quite felt before or since. The quiet, still nature of the early days of the pandemic shutdown had a quiet and peacefulness rarely found in populated areas. Nowhere to go, nothing to do. Like Yom Kippur in Israel when highways are empty and kids ride bikes down main thoroughfares because the grown-ups are indoors, atoning for their sins. But of course, there was a shadow over the spring, like the dark parts of Yom Kippur, where we ask, Mi yamut u'mi yechyeh, who shall live and who shall die? There were a couple of moments when it felt overwhelming. There was one time, still in March, when a couple of congregants were quarantined and unable to get tested. On a phone call, it really sounded like their inscription was sealed for the worst. Was this really what we were all reduced to? Sit alone in quarantine and hope you don't die? I walked the empty, abandoned hallways of this building and I cried. But life is unpredictable. They pulled through. Others didn't. Prayers we say next to the deathbed, prayers that pull on the Yom Kippur themes of confession and repentance, I would say over FaceTime with nurses kindly holding iPhones up for dying patients in hospital rooms where visitors weren't allowed. Funerals became tightly choreographed and limited to immediate family. The well-honed rhythms of Jewish mourning were interrupted in ways I previously would have never imagined or condoned. Many of you have attended a Zoom Shiva, or a Zoom Bat Mitzvah, or a Zoom wedding, or a Zoom bris. Just the guests are on Zoom, not the moil. That much hasn't changed. And all these moments are meaningful and necessary, and mediating our interactions through technology is fine, but it's still not quite the same. People aren't screens. Living separate and alone, dying separate and alone. Dor lech v'dor ba. A generation goes and a generation comes. These moments must change us. A particularly painful moment for me and for more than a few of us were the deaths from COVID-19 this April of Margit Feldman and 9 days later of her husband, Harvey Feldman. But in this year of plague, there was no Shiva. In this time of distancing, we were unable to gather by their graves to properly remember their remarkable lives. Margit and Harvey were memorialized in some public spaces, notably by Governor Murphy in his briefings and Anderson Cooper on TV. But there's more that needs to be said, and more that needs to be done. Because we're a people, Am Echad, one people. And we feel the tribal and familial connections so strongly that we still need that moment of us as a community, an extended family, to pause and to remember, to fix our thoughts and emotions, because we look to the future. We live in the present, but we are the bearers of memory. We are not born into a vacuum. Our world carries the blessings and the traumas of those who have gone before us. Now, Harvey was a great guy to talk sports with, always up for a light, convivial moment. Part of the joy of Harvey's penchant for jokes and banter is the topics were always so different from my conversations with Margit. Many of us knew Margit, many of us did not. She was 14 when she was deported along with her family and the Jewish residents of her town to Auschwitz. It's our absolute obligation to ensure that our lives, each and every day, are informed by what we know about her life. And to know that if we are not the bearers of memory, no one will do it for us. Every year, I tend to hold back on talking about the Shoah on the high holidays. This is one part of Jewish life and should not be confused with the totality of Jewish life. Jewish life is paramount. Jewish death can never define us. And I fear that sometimes when we go light on the Jewish practice and heavy on the Jewish suffering, we give our children, ourselves, and others the exact wrong impression of Judaism. When we focus on memorials to the Jewish dead rather than adding to the richness of Jewish life, we misrepresent a culture where we are commanded to v'charta b'chaim, to choose life. And in a year when we lost Margit's voice, This is what we must remember before we say Yizkor. Now, Margit's memories can be read in her autobiography and should be. I know, I don't like reading Holocaust books either. And, just as the tradition teaches us, to know how to refute a heretic, and lo ta'mod al dam re'echa, may not stand idly by while your neighbor bleeds. It's important to be the kind of person who does not avoid an obligation because it is hard, inconvenient, or out of step with the cheerfulness that's asked of us in the real or in the virtual world. Now, I cannot do her justice. Born on the same day as Anne Frank, and in prison at Bergen-Belsen at the same time as Anne, Margit Burkhalter's life in Tolzfa in Hungary was warm and unremarkable until the dark clouds of war and hatred gathered. You know how these stories go. The daring kindness and unimaginable cruelty of neighbors, and more frequently the indifference to the suffering of the other, the desperate love of parents, the 15,000 Jewish residents who were deported from our home region in the spring of 1944, 250 survived the next 12 months. Of Margit's extended family, 68 were deported. 2 survived. Upon their arrival in Auschwitz, after an agonizingly slow journey in the hell of the cattle cars, packed in with already starving children, agonized mothers, traumatized others already taking their own lives, causing more screams as their blood spattered up on there to the neighbors. Margit and her family arrived in the extermination camp they didn't know existed. Pulled off the train cars, men and women were lined up separately. Margit wrote, "At one point, my father broke out of the line of men and ran over to me. I never expected him to do such a thing. I was in a state of shock. I will never forget this moment as long as I live. His face was snow white as he put his hands on either side of my head. As he did this, he uttered a blessing in Hebrew, in the same manner as he did on every Shabbat Eve. Smech Elohim Kasara, Rivka, Rachel, V'Leah. May God give you the blessings of Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. He cautioned me to look after myself and to be a good girl. For this, he was seized by the German soldiers, and beaten mercilessly before my eyes, then pulled back in line while the beating continued. He never had the chance to say goodbye to his wife or his female relatives. Soon he, like so many others, was to be taken away. My last sight of him was as he stood in line, bent over from the blows he had received, blood streaming down his face." This, of course, is hardly the worst of it. It's quite literally just the beginning. But what do we do with it? It's one thing to know it. It's also important to feel it. Our intellectual apprehension of history is one thing, but we will be motivated to act only by cultivating a deep emotional connection to who we are, from where we come, and what our obligations are. We must know and feel these things and respond to them regardless of the social light, of the social consequences, regardless of our political climate, and truly live in the light of our obligations, to live the best of the Jewish tradition, and to stand against the worst impulses in humanity. It's Yom Kippur. We know the list of selfishness and bigotry and exploitation. It's in the book. Margit was dedicated to education. She is not here to remember, so we must remember. She's not here to teach, so we must teach. But still, it's about more than that. One of the great debates is when Rabbi Akiva says that Klal Gadol, the organizing principle of the Torah, is love your neighbor as yourself. In other words, you have to use this line as the lens through which all of Torah is seen. If any phrase contradicts love your neighbor as yourself, you're reading it wrong, because all has to reflect that. But Rabbi Akiva's colleague Ben Azai disagrees. He says that a line in the genealogies of Genesis, Zeh Sefer Toldot Adam, this is the chronicle of the descendants of Adam, is an even greater principle. The long stream of begats is usually on the most boring list, not the most important list. But Ben Azai thinks that knowing all humans have equal claim to dignity and life is paramount. No matter our color, no matter our belief, no matter our place of birth, no matter our political opinion, no matter our level of education, no matter how we identify or dress or where we live, the central principle of the Torah is we all come from the same place. Don't think you are inherently better than anyone else, nor that anyone is better than you. The debate, which is the most important line, is never settled. We're left to live with them both. Many of you know that in the late 1980s, Margit went to London, procuring a Sefer Torah, a scroll that was confiscated by the Nazis, slated for their planned museum of the despised extinct race. And we'll read from that Torah tomorrow, for we're anything but extinct. And standing before that Torah, the legacy of over 3,000 years of our people's striving, itself written by hand over 300 years ago, brought here in the wake of humanity's darkest moment. What can we say? What can we do? What are our obligations? Now, I cannot speak for Margit Feldman, for Harvey Feldman, for their family. But I needed to give this hesped, this eulogy, that we didn't get to hear this spring, when she died, 75 years to the week after her liberation from Bergen-Belsen. We all need to feel the pain of loss, of the tragedies of the past year, and of the past century. We need to remember that with one last chance to speak, Margit's father brought words of the tradition, the blessings of Shabbos dinners that weren't just nice family moments, but moments where past, present, and future met. And we need to take the short view and the long view. We need to live this Torah, never neglect it, and know that its great principles, love your neighbor as yourself, love the stranger as yourself, know that everyone you see is your brother and your sister, and all the more so even if you don't see them, they are your sisters and brothers. You are now the carrier of memory, as am I. We are the Jewish people. Together, we'll live up to the ethical obligations that come with that. And we will draw on the shining example of the tzaddikim who came before us and showed us how to never give up on a life of love and goodness. Zichronam tzaddikim livracha. May the memory of the righteous be for a blessing. And may the Holy One, whose ways are unknowable, grant us the strength and courage to live lives worthy of the memories we carry, and help us craft a future. Egel kamayim mishpat, tzedakah kanachal etan. Justice wells up like water, and righteousness like an unfailing stream. Gemar Chatima Tova. May you and your loved ones be inscribed for a good, healthy, meaningful year.